Welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm your host and co-founder, Aaron Breitman. It's my pleasure to welcome in Brad Wachtel of Facts and Bracks, Field of 68 as well. It's 1 week left in the regular season, and I wanted to get the best bracketologist that I know, ranked top 10 in Bracket Matrix. Brad, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Aaron. Definitely, this is the best time of year.
Absolutely. I can't believe I was game planning in my head all season when I was going to have you on. And for a little bit there, I was like, oh, it's going to be kind of a boring episode. There's not going to be not going to be a lot of speculation, maybe a 4 or 5 seed. And now obviously things got pretty interesting for Rutgers. Wanted to ask just in terms of starting point last night, the win over Penn State, the impact of that win, both for Rutgers. And I thought, it was such a huge game also because for Penn State, what the impact was for both teams.
Yeah, it was a huge game for both teams. For Penn State heading into that game, they were my first team out of the field. So a win over Rutgers probably would have put them in for the time being. A loss now ends up taking them out of the first 4 out and into the next 4 out. For Penn State's purposes, they're not done, but now suddenly they need to win their last 2 games to really have a good shot to get in. So that loss was a killer for the Nittany Lions. In terms of Rutgers, I mean, that game, if they had lost, it would have been a quad 1 loss. It would not have been the end of the world. But then all of a sudden, you would have had to go into the game at Minnesota with a ton of pressure on you. A game, yes, they beat Minnesota by 30 at home, but road games could be different, and you just never know. You don't want to leave it to chance. So this win kind of like gives everybody, the team, fans, maybe a little bit of a sigh of relief heading into the game in Minnesota, where now they could play to not just try to win to get into the tournament, but win to try and improve their metrics and improve their seed.
That's a really good point. And I guess the other thing I thought that was interesting about Rutgers Penn State was that if they had lost that game, you could compare the two schools. And I mean, I think there could have been an argument where Penn State, by a lot of bracketologists, could have been projected over Rutgers. Do you agree?
I don't think that I would have them over Rutgers, but there are a lot of areas that they were better than Rutgers. First of all, if Rutgers lost, and I had all this stuff going through my mind because, of course, Rutgers was down 19 points in the second half. You're like, this is not good. Rutgers would have had 4 bad losses on the resume. No at-large team has 4 bad losses currently. Their strength of record probably would have dropped towards 60. No at-large team has a strength of record outside of the top 50. And then the way they've played without Mawat Mag at that point, if they happen to get blown out, they would have been 1-5. And it's like, can this team win without him? And now all of a sudden, the committee is not just looking at the metrics and your quadrant numbers and all of that. They're looking at your actual roster. And if they say this team is not a tournament team without Mawat Mag, well, that changes everything. So that win was so big on many parts.
That's really interesting. So that leads to my next question in terms of, and I think it's not maybe that well understood. Everyone knows about net rankings now. But in terms of what the committee actually looks at when they're deciding the field, can you talk about the team sheets and what's on there, how the information is organized, and kind of how it's presented to the committee?
Sure. The team sheet has every piece of information you could possibly need to judge a team. You start with, first of all, their record, which doesn't mean a whole lot. They show the team's net. They show what their record is against quad 1 opponents, quad 2 opponents, quad 3 and 4. Their record against high quadrant 1 opponents. So basically what a high quadrant 1 opponent is for people that don't know, if you beat a home team, if you beat a team at home that's rated in the net 1 through 15, that's a high quad 1 win. If you beat a team on a neutral court that's top 25 in the net, that's a high quad 1 win. And if you beat a road team that's in the top 37 of the net, that is considered a high quad 1 win. And the committee has shown over the years that they really value those high quad 1 wins. And right now, Rutgers just has the one at Purdue, but that's a big one. And then going along, they also look at all of your bad losses. They look at what your non-conference strength of schedule is. And if that stands out like a sore thumb, which it actually does for Rutgers, another piece that would have hurt them had they lost to Penn State. They look at your road neutral record, and then they look at different metrics. There's your result-based metrics, and then there's predictive metrics. The result-based metrics are your strength of record. That's run through ESPN, and KPI is another metric that basically it's supposed to take into account injuries that you have, and it kind of gets adjusted. So if you're winning games without a certain player, if you're losing games without a certain player, but these are all metrics. They're like, you take everything with a grain of salt. There's so many of them. And then there's the predictive metrics. The one that most people know is the KenPom, and you could always see what KenPom has anyone rated, and that's kind of the how they predict you're going to play if you get in the NCAA tournament. Just looking at Rutgers result-based and predictive-based, their result-based, where their strength of record is at 50 right now, whereas their predictives are actually at 28.0 on average. Now, again, that is taking into account how they played all season. Right. But from that standpoint, you kind of they think that Rutgers will play better than what their results have shown. And then the other two predictive metrics are BPI, which is also through ESPN, and Sadrin, which is another one that basically tells you how you're going to play. And a lot of times what the committee does, they'll take the average of your result-based metrics and the average of your predictive metrics when looking at it, just so they could get a better read on teams.
That's really good information. And in terms of, so when you said predictive metrics, and because that does tie into KenPom with Rutgers in terms of the luck factor, people tend to misunderstand what that means with KenPom, but it basically means your record should be better than what your efficiency ratings are. And Rutgers is, last time I checked, they were in the 350s, meaning that they should have been, the record should be a lot better. So a couple of things in terms of contingencies. How much, I guess, on the team sheet, is there anything about like miscellaneous, for example, Rutgers, right? The Ohio State game. How much is that in? We talked about it in December, but it's really kind of crazy how, looking back on it now, that one extra win really would have helped. I mean, it still would have been a quad one victory, right? With Ohio State, as bad as they've been in the Big Ten, they're still in the top 75 for a road win to be a quad one.
Absolutely. It would have been a quad one. That moves you to 7-1 against Q1 opponents, which looks even better to be 2 games over 500. Now, I could say that, yes, it's there, but at the same time, I don't know, because there are so many things that have gone on throughout the course of the season that could be considered miscellaneous. There are things like, you take it, for example, a team like New Mexico, who their best player missed 2 games and they ended up losing one of them. It was a quad 4 game, and they lost another that was a quad 3 game. How is the committee gonna react to that? I feel like there's so many things that add up over the course of a season that they don't take everything into account. They might say they do, but I honestly don't think it's realistic. Now, in Rutgers' case, obviously a game that they basically came out and said they should have won, that should be taken into account. But if I'm being honest, and that's my honest opinion, is I don't think it will.
I wonder if it's almost more, because I always wondered, would it be more used as a tiebreaker if it was in or out, not necessarily taken into account for seeding purposes?
It's a good point, but I think they would look at a lot of the other metrics that, especially in Rutgers' case, that they have that are actually negative, where they have three bad losses. They have one of the worst non-conference strength of schedules, a poor road neutral record. My gut tells me that no, it would not be taken into account.
Yeah. Well, and then you have the Michigan State game, which some people are still upset about, that, it was counted as a quad 1 going into it and then taken away.
I mean, that one is like, I feel like it's even more of a gripe because that's just it's up to the league. Like if you remember earlier in the season, Penn State played Purdue at the Palestra, and
Right.
they actually originally called it a neutral site game, and then after the game happened, they called it a Penn State home game.
Yeah, that was wild. That's why when the Rutgers thing happened, I was obviously upset, but I was like, well, it's not actually as bad as Penn State playing the game and then them taking it away after the fact, which is
Right.
just crazy.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then I was wondering, I know people are going to ask about injuries. I know you were saying about Mag, it gets taken into account. Is it the same team in terms of being able to win? But what about even something as kind of detailed as like one of Rutgers' the worst loss that Rutgers has in the resume, Temple, Caleb McConnell and Paul Mulcahy both did not play. Is it because it's kind of a one-off, might not get taken account as much, or do you think that would be considered at all?
I think that will be considered. You're
Okay.
missing You're missing two starters from your lineup, and for a while that was Rutgers' only bad loss. Well, I guess because the Seton Hall game became a bad loss for now, and
Yeah.
obviously Nebraska, who's
But they're not
getting
far away. Those
they're
two games are
not.
not far away from quad two.
Nebraska isn't the same old Nebraska. So even though it
Yeah.
was a Q3 loss, it wasn't like losing to Lafayette last year.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, no, that definitely gets taken into account because that's one of your bad losses. And I think one thing that they'll look at is they'll see Rutgers is a team that has 3 bad losses on their resume. And as I mentioned earlier, no team has 3 bad losses that's in the field right now. They'll
Mhm.
see that and they'll say, wait a minute, one came against Temple, they're missing 2 starters. Yeah, the way they played after that is, you don't dismiss it, but you note it, and it's like, okay, that's not a big deal.
And on the flip side of that, would any, I guess, like the quad one win at Wisconsin, McConnell didn't play. Is that taken into account at all, or probably not?
Nah, probably not. Probably not. I mean, I think if it's if there's like with the Mag injury, an extended injury where they get a lot to read on,
Mhm.
but a one-off like that where it's just one player, and plus they won.
Right.
So, I don't think that they're going to read into that at all.
But that would, I guess, play into the results-based, right, metrics in terms of
Correct.
winning without McConnell. It actually does
Yeah.
give it a little more oomph.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's really good. So I think those are all my contingency questions. So you went into a little bit with the good and the bad of the Rutgers resume. How good is the good on Rutgers' resume?
The good is very good. 6-6 against Q1 opponents is very good. You playing in the Big Ten. You have a lot of opportunities to be 500 or above is definitely noteworthy, and it's something that they should be proud of because it's not easy to do. Now their net, where last year at this point we
Yeah.
were scared about their net. Their net was in the mid 70s, and a team had never gotten in with that poor of a net, but they did it. Now their net is 32, so the net is in great shape. So that's nothing to worry about. Another positive is that they're over 500 against Q1 plus Q2 opponents, so they're 9-8.
Mhm.
That is very nice to have. If you could be over 500 in that category, and if you could be over 500, which they still can, now Northwestern would be a Q2.
Mhm.
But potentially seeing what happens in the Big Ten tournament, they could add to that Q1, the Q1 wins. But 6-6 is a really, really nice point to be at. So those are the positives, as well as their predictive metrics, as I mentioned earlier. They come out to an average of 28.0. Now, you don't get seeded just by predictive metrics, but 28, you're basically, on the border of like a 7 and an 8 seed. You're
Mhm.
basically a 7 seed. So that's how that works out.
And obviously 6 quad one wins. Do they how does it get, I guess, calculated in the fact that 4 of those did come on the road?
It matters. The committee loves road wins. They love, as you saw in the top 16 reveal, they love high Q1 wins the most. And
Mhm.
Rutgers has one of those. Those are very, very difficult to come by. Very difficult. Which is why their win over Purdue is basically like a 3 seed bump for them.
Hmm.
And as we mentioned before, if they did not win at Purdue, and let's say they lost at Penn State, they would probably be out of the field right now. That's
Wow.
how important that win was for them.
Wow.
And yeah, so the road wins are huge. Even though you look at Rutgers' road neutral record, and this is where it's a little deceiving, they're 4-7 road neutral, which is not very good. However, they did not play in a preseason tournament, so they didn't have the opportunity to pick up any neutral site wins, where a lot of these other teams picked up neutral site wins over maybe mid-major teams. That's one part of the area with Rutgers' schedule that I would consider changing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it could benefit them. Play in a neutral site tournament, get a couple wins. It doesn't even have to be, you don't have to go into like the toughest tournament out there, but that's going to help improve their road neutral record, so that it doesn't seem like they're so far off every other team.
Right. And we went into this in detail last year. I remember talking about the non-conference schedule, all the quad four opponents. Rutgers, obviously, not even the games that they did win were not very convincing from a margin of victory standpoint. And it stuck in my head. You always mentioned Iowa as being a team that, did it the right way in regard to if they're going to schedule that many quad four opponents, you blow them out of the water. And Rutgers has actually done that this year. Is that, I guess, how much, but it's funny. Iowa got burned this year because they lost at Eastern Illinois, one of maybe the worst loss of any projected team, right?
Yep, that's correct. Now, in that case, they were missing 2 starters. So that's
Okay.
so you see what I mean? Like, it works for different teams, but it's still a loss. It doesn't matter.
Right.
It's still a quad 4 loss. Yeah, so there's positives and negatives to scheduling like that. Rutgers did it again, but I think they went into it with the mindset of knowing how the net works a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of maybe putting in their bench a little bit earlier, they kept their foot on the gas and they obliterated these teams.
Yeah.
And all of that, even though, instead of winning by 20 points, they won by 35 points or 40 points. All of that plays a role in the net. So every game they did that. If you do it once, it's not going to have that much of a change. But if you do it 5 or 6 times, it helps for sure.
And that brings me up to I had messaged you after last week that Illinois, beating Minnesota, and they were up 16 points with 2 minutes to go. They bring in the subs, and then Minnesota hits a 3 at the buzzer, and they lose by 9 points.
Mm-hmm.
And Illinois ended up going backwards in the net.
It's something that people have to pay attention to, and it seems like, I get it. Sometimes you want to pull your guys. You don't want to risk an injury. You feel like maybe it's not worth, keeping guys in there for an extended period of time. But Illinois is very close to Rutgers in the projected seeds at the moment. So it could end up playing a difference between being a 7 seed and an 8 seed and a 9 seed when it's all said and done. Maybe their net would be a few slots higher. But every team has their own beliefs.
So, and I should clarify that Illinois game was at home, so that was a big part of it. Where being on the road, and that kind of leads to my next point. I'd like to go through a couple of scenarios. Let's start with the doomsday scenario for Rutgers fans. They lose at Minnesota. They lose to Northwestern. They lose in the opening round of the Big Ten tournament, putting you on the spot right off the bat. Does Rutgers make the NCAA tournament? I know that's a loaded question because of the rest of the field, but what's your gut say in terms of where they're at right now?
Loaded question. My gut tells me they still make it, and they'll be in Dayton. But I think so. If they lose their next 2, I think that drops them to a 10 or an 11 seed. And yeah, you're going to need to. You could be in Dayton even with 1 win in the tournament, because, like we said before, that you're adding another bad loss to the resume, bringing you to 4 bad losses. And that's in the committee's mind since it happened so recently. Even though there isn't supposed to be recency bias, there's definitely some recency bias. So I would say right now, they'd still get in, but I wouldn't guarantee it. And I think it will boil down to how other teams on the bubble play, and if there are any bid stealers from any of the mid-major conferences or high major conferences.
All right, so let's bring it back in. Let's say they win at Minnesota. Let's say they let's go the opposite. Let's say they win at Minnesota. They beat Northwestern. They win one game in the Big Ten tournament. How much? I should clarify. Why don't you say where you currently have them projected as a seed, and where you think with that scenario, winning out the regular season, winning one Big Ten tournament, where you would see them after that?
Yeah. So right now, I currently have them as a middle of the pack 8 seed.
Mm-hmm.
If they beat Minnesota and beat Northwestern, that'll bring them up to probably a 7 seed. It's not going to get them up much higher because, again, Minnesota's a Q3. Now, depending on how they play, what if they win by 30? That could change things.
Mm-hmm.
And Northwestern, while they're one of the better teams in the league record-wise, it would just be a quadrant 2 win. So it doesn't do a whole lot for them. So for me, they're kind of like probably a 7, probably borderline 7-8, but probably a 7. And then if you win one game in the tournament, I don't think they would be higher than a 7.
Okay. So let's say they split this week. They beat Minnesota. They lose to Northwestern. Different scenarios: win a game in the Big Ten, lose out the first game.
Lose out. So win a game in the Big Ten tournament, and
the other scenario.
Okay, and then gotcha, and then lose.
Yeah.
Okay,
or they lose their first game in the Big Ten tournament.
Yep. So if they beat Minnesota, lose to Northwestern, at the end of the regular season, they're looking at an 8 or a 9 seed, heading into the Big Ten tourney. If they win a game, it's going to depend on the opponent, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're saying like it's a Michigan State, or an Iowa or a team, a team like that, if they end up in the 8-9 game, or if they're a 7-10 game, maybe Penn State, it's not going to elevate their seed much. Maybe gets them to an area where they're like one of the top 8 seeds, possibly 7 based on other results. It's going to depend on how other teams in their projected seed vicinity do as well. If they lose a game, the first game of the tournament, they're probably looking at a 9 or a 10 seed.
Okay, so basically you beat Minnesota, you avoid disaster, any potential bubble talk really, and worst case, you're looking at a 10 seed, most likely.
That's what I believe. I think you beat Minnesota. I think you should avoid Dayton.
Right. And even, you could still be an 11 seed and avoid Dayton, right? Too?
You could still be an 11 seed and avoid Dayton, correct?
Right.
I think 10 seed is probably likely. But again, look, how's North Carolina going to play the rest of the way? They're up big on Florida State right now. Their metrics are really good. If they go on a run, they could zoom up the boards, up the seed lines. Like there are still different things that can be affected. So everything is an estimation.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that people always ask is regions, right? So we know Rutgers is mostly slotted probably in that 7 to 10 range right now, right? Realistically, or worse if they do lose. I know that they say the top 4 seeds are usually prioritized by region for location, right? How does it work after that? So is there any dream potential for Rutgers to be in Albany and have local draw, and then with the real dream of the potential of playing in the Garden in the Sweet 16?
It's possible for sure. I wouldn't say it's likely considering there's 4 different regions. So
right.
basically what you're doing, what the committee does is obviously they're not going to match you up against a team that you've played. So any team in the Big Ten, if Rutgers is a 9 seed, they're not going to be matched up against a Big Ten 8 seed. They're not going to be matched up with any team that they've already played in the first round. As well as they wouldn't match you up with a team in the second round. So if they were in the 8-9 game and Purdue is a 1 seed, they're not going to be in the same region.
Right.
So right now, as it stands today, Purdue is the 4th number 1 seed. And the way it works pretty much is each number 1 seed gets preference of where they want to go, what region is. And you're always going to pick the region closest to your location.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, the number 1 overall seed is Alabama. and they would go into the South region. The number 2 overall seed is Houston. They would choose to go in the Midwest. The number 3 is Kansas. Kansas is right in between Las Vegas and MSG, so they would have their choice. Let's say they choose Las Vegas. That means Purdue goes to MSG, which means if Rutgers is an 8 or 9 seed, they can't be in the East. So there's a lot that goes into it. I will say there's a chance, but I'll say there's not a great chance because they're not giving Rutgers any sort of priority or preferential treatment to get where they want to be.
Right. So the Rutgers fans just say, but we'll sell out the Garden. It has nothing to do with it.
it's not the NIT of 10 years ago, 15
we'll sell out
years
the Garden
ago.
anyway. It doesn't matter who's there.
Right.
And so aside from that, it's really just a kind of a wild card in terms of where they could end up. And like you said, it probably has a lot to do with who else in their conference is in that bracket.
Correct.
So let's talk about the Big Ten in terms of how many teams you see right now making the field and who's in consideration.
Yep. So right now it's funny because every time I get asked the question, how many teams I have in, when I do my bracket predictions, I don't do it by conference. I do it by actual teams. But I'll tell you who I have in right now. So right now, obviously you have Purdue, you have Maryland, you have Indiana is 3, Michigan State is 4, Illinois is 5, Rutgers is 6, Iowa is 7. I have Wisconsin in right now. Wisconsin is 8. Did I say Illinois?
I can't remember. Let's go
remember.
Back. Let's see. We had you had Purdue, Maryland, Indiana was the 3rd team you mentioned.
9 teams. It's 9 teams.
So
it's 9 teams right now. I have Michigan and Penn State both in the first 8 teams out of the field at the moment. Now, all these teams are not going to get in. They're not going to get 11 teams. Probably won't get 10. I think 9 is a realistic number with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Penn State fighting it out. I think Wisconsin has the slight edge at the moment based on the number of Q1 wins. And they also play Purdue next. So a win over Purdue at home would be huge for them.
Yeah.
But Michigan has at Indiana and at Illinois coming up, whereas you could see that and say that's 0-2. But if that's somehow 2-0, the way Michigan's playing the team.
Right. So if Michigan takes advantage of that road swing, that could change the whole picture.
Yes. Now, the one thing about the Big Ten, you have Purdue, and obviously the way Indiana has played of late, I know Rutgers fans won't agree because Rutgers plays well against Indiana for the most part. Actually, more than for the most part. Indiana's rising up the boards, the seed line, and they're currently a 3 or a 4 seed in many projections at the moment. So other than those 2 teams, it seems like there's a lot of good Big Ten teams, not great Big Ten teams, but teams that are going to be seeded kind of between the 6 to 11 seed range. So it'll be interesting because it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of teams you have to make sure aren't playing each other and can't be in the same region. So the selection committee has a lot of work to do for them, as well as the Big 12, who has a lot of teams on the 2 and 3 seed lines. So it gets very interesting when trying to separate all of these teams.
That's a good point. And you always say this, that, they don't take into account, where you finish in the conference. But do they like say it comes down to a Big Ten team and another team, would it actually hurt that bubble team from the Big Ten because the conference is already getting 9 teams? Or it really doesn't? It just comes down to resume versus resume.
Comes down to resume versus resume. Like, for example, though, you look at some bubble teams right now. So let's take from the Big 12, a West Virginia. There's a chance West Virginia finishes in conference play at 7-11 or 6-12. And they could be, and the reason why West Virginia is being considered is because their metrics are so good. Now, if they finish 6-12, I don't think they're going to get in, but they will be considered. And it's funny, like you're matching up a potential 6-12 or 7-11 team, let's say compared to a Michigan who's on the bubble, and let's say they're 12-8. Let's say they finish 12-8 in Big Ten play. The average fan would look at that and say, yeah, this is a no-brainer, but the committee will dig deeper and they look at everything.
So that goes to the point that the Big 12, metrics wise, is way ahead of any other conference.
Yes, the Big 12, it's not even close because top to bottom, Texas Tech and Oklahoma are the two worst teams. And right now, if you were to play them on their home court, it would be considered a quad one game.
Wow. And on the flip side of that is the ACC, right? Having a really bad year metrics wise. I mean, a lot of really, really bad teams. So for like a North Carolina, like you said, I mean, it's almost like they have more work to do because a lot of the teams they're going to be playing are even sub 200.
Yeah, they definitely have more work to do because, in a league like the Big 12 and Big 10, you have opportunities. North Carolina, every game is not an opportunity. It could be an opportunity to hurt themselves. They have more opportunities of that. But North Carolina, you look at them, you look at a team like Clemson, who's on the outside of the bubble looking in. And then, they're even the teams that are like a Duke, they're in the tournament. But what I'm saying is, how are they going to be seeded with how poor the conference is?
Yeah.
If you watch them play right now, they probably look better than an 8 seed, but I actually have them as my last 7 seed at the moment. But you know what? Like with that conference, they're not playing good teams. Other than Virginia and Miami, there's a lot of average teams in that league, and then there's a lot of bad teams in that league.
Do you think they're even going to get a top 4 seed?
I think Virginia right now would be a 4 seed. Virginia has 2 games left, both at home against Clemson and Louisville. You would anticipate they'll win both of those games. Assuming they do, they should be a 4 seed, a top 4 seed. If they happen to lose one of those games, they may not be a top 4 seed. And the team that's in first place in that league, like imagine this scenario in the Big Ten. The team that's in first place in that league is Pittsburgh. Right now, Pittsburgh is a projected 9 or 10 seed.
Yeah, that's wild. And I saw Pitt people upset about the fact with the predictive metrics is that North Carolina was still ranked ahead of them in the net, even though they beat them twice.
Exactly. It's crazy. A lot of it has to do with your non-conference strength of schedule, how you play, not always who you beat. Some of their losses were not particularly good. Pittsburgh has a Q4 loss. But then it's like, well, Pittsburgh won at Northwestern by almost 30 points.
Yeah. Crazy.
Earlier.
I remember I couldn't believe that game.
Couldn't believe it. At that point, people thought Pittsburgh was like one of the worst teams in the ACC, and they're like, okay, Northwestern must stink. And then Northwestern ends up being, in second place a few days ago.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. That's one of the weirdest results of the season. But then Pitt also has 2 terrible losses, right? Slipping my mind, but they have like a 25-point loss to someone terrible. Is it Florida State?
Yes. They have one bad loss. They lost to Florida State at home. And then they have another couple losses. I don't know who it was, but they got blown out in a couple games that really screwed up their metrics. But that just goes to show you that every game counts. Every game has an effect on your resume.
So a couple more for you, Brad. I did want to ask you about the net, and it's funny how last year, obviously it's biased in terms of Rutgers fans hated the net because we were in the 80s and 70s all season. This year you don't really hear any of that, especially when Rutgers was as in the teens for a good portion of it, which was still surreal. I guess from your perspective with what you do, what would you change about the net? And what would you change about the net? And what do you think has the best chance to actually be changed in the near future?
Actually, the thing I would change is probably the thing that probably has the best chance of being changed. And that is who are quadrant 1 teams, who are quadrant 2 teams, and so on.
Okay.
So a road win right now against a quadrant 1 team is teams with a net of 1 through 75. I don't think it should be that much. I've thought about this a lot. I don't know if it should be 1 through 50 or 1 through 60, somewhere either 50 or 60. I feel like those wins, it's a quad 1 win. It needs to matter. Like you have a good number of quad 1 wins right now that are against teams that are not tournament teams.
Mm.
Wisconsin right now is, around 70 in the net. They are barely a tournament team at the moment, but, there are teams like, let me pull it up real quick so I don't make a mistake, but there are teams, let's say UCF is 71 in the net. If you play at their place, that's a quad one game. Oklahoma, who has 3 or 4 wins in conference play, they're 66 in the net. You play at their place, it's a quad one place, a quad one game. Sam Houston State is 62 in the net. If you play at their place, it's a Q1. Bradley, all these teams, like North Texas, there's so many of these teams where they're not at large teams, and yet if you play there and win, it counts as a quad one win. So I feel like that needs to be adjusted. I like how it is in terms of how they weight it for home wins and road wins, because road wins are harder to get, so those should be valued more.
Right.
I don't have an issue with top 30 beating a top 30 team at home. I think that's fine. It's just you need to make the good wins like even more special, and maybe they could create some sort of a point system, like for high quadrant one wins. Like if Rutgers wins at Purdue, number 4 team in the net, like that should give you points. Like I think it'd be really cool if there was a point system that the committee could go by and reference. So it kind of like consolidate everything, so you're not looking at a million different things. I think that's something that is probably a little bit unrealistic. I don't know if I could see them doing something like that.
Yeah.
But that would be cool to see for me.
Yeah, that would be awesome. That's a great idea. I just wonder if they really want that much transparency.
Correct. They don't want the transparency, just like they don't want us to know the formula of the net.
Right.
Some better things are left unsaid.
Well, which leads me to my last question. Then I have one comment for you. But in terms of, is the net the be all end all in terms of how they ultimately make their decisions and their seeding decisions?
No, it is not. And as we could tell from last year with Rutgers in the mid 70s, it's just a part. It's just a part of their resume. I think it plays a little bit of a role in terms of seeding. But if you have the wins, I think your record against quadrant one opponents, more in particular, high quadrant one and road wins, I think that's what they look at. That's the most important, because if you have those wins, that's going to put you involved. If you don't have those wins and you have a poor net, then you have no chance. But they'll read into it and say, why is their net so poor? What are the reasons? Is it because of just one bad loss, or is there something more to it that we're not seeing? Is it because they only win at home and they don't win on the road? So it's just a part of all the things that we mentioned earlier on this podcast. Are things that they look at, and they don't particularly value one thing that much more over the other, except your key wins, which is the most important.
Right. And is there anything that we didn't talk about that they do consider, aside, anything non-metric based, non-predictive based, I don't know if that exists. I'm just curious in terms of people when they hear it's not all net. What else could there be of anything we talked about?
Other than that, it's just injuries.
Okay.
I mean, that's really the other major thing that they would consider.
Is the last 10 a thing? Is that still a thing?
No, the last 10, and then it became the last 12. That stopped being a thing like over 10 years ago. However, when we saw the top 16 reveal 2 weeks ago, it showed
it, right?
There was some recency bias because UConn is a team that had excellent metrics across the board, beat Alabama on a neutral court, who was the number 1 overall seed, and they weren't even a top 4 seed because they kind of had struggled of late, had an 8-7 Big East record. So that leads me to believe that there is some recency bias, which, I'm fine with that, but people need to know that if that's the case.
Yeah, I feel like it's the networks that still show the old graphics where they put the last 10 games. Right. They still use that. But it was when you said they haven't used it in a decade, the committee, That actually surprised me because I feel like every year you still see when the networks show resumes, they still show last 10 record.
They do, and it doesn't mean anything, except if you're a committee member and you happen to be watching that game and you see that and it's in the back of your mind. You never know what they take into account.
All right. I really appreciate all your time. Last kind of thing I just wanted to ask you if you could just very briefly summarize where you see Rutgers right now. And, because I'm going to get yelled at for not asking this question. If they did make a run in the Big Ten tournament, like a two wins or more, how much would that really impact them?
So right now, at this current moment, I have Rutgers as an 8 seed, a solid 8 seed. If things go well and they make a deep run in the Big Ten tournament, I will caution you because, first of all, over the last few years, the last number of years, the committee barely takes into account how you play on Saturday and Sunday in your conference tournament. Sunday, the championship is ends a half an hour before its selection Sunday. The show starts. So that game, unless it determines a placement in the field, your seed's not changing. The committee really figures it out by Friday evening. So with that in mind, I think Rutgers' ceiling is a 5 seed.
Okay.
I don't see them getting higher than that. Even if they win the Big Ten tournament, I don't see them being better than a 5 seed.
So if they make it to the semis, they win 2 games probably based on their seeding. We'll have to see. They get to the Big Ten semis. That's in a way that's as best as they can improve their seed.
Yeah, and I would say if they got to the semis, I could see a 6 potentially. But yeah, we would have to see how everything else plays out.
Brad Wachtel, really appreciate all your time. Facts and Bracks, check it out. You're updating how often right now?
I'm doing it twice a week, but beginning next week, it'll be done every day.
And tell everyone where they can find you.
Yep, you could find me on Twitter at Brad_Wachtel, and also where I post my projections at factsandbracks.blogspot.com.
And you're on the Field of 68 how often now?
So I'm on the Field of 68 podcast twice a week. Next week, it might be a few more than that. They're typically done at 5 p.m. each day. I think they're going to be doing it almost every day next week. And then at the minimum, they're going to have an updated consolidated bracket every day next week.
Brad, always one of my favorite guests. Really appreciate all your time. And hopefully Rutgers fans won't have to sweat it out too much. We win on Thursday, and then it'll be fun, actually, the first time we could actually just worry about the seed and not actually getting in or not. All right. Thank you, Brad.
Exactly. It should be fun. All right. Take care.